Hi, my lovelies. Welcome to session number 7 of the module Social Influence. We are in obedience. In the last session, we looked at Milgram's original study where we found that 65% of the participants continued to give shocks up, right? And that was at 450 volts. So we concluded that the legitimacy of the authority figure does impact on obedience. What Milgram wanted to do thereafter, he wanted to see if he changed just one situational variable, what effect would it have on the level of obedience? So we're going to be now looking at situational variables. We're going to be looking at Milgram's variations, and there are 3 areas that the spec says that we need to look at, and that is changes to proximity, location, and uniform. So these are situations. Remember, situational means what's happening in the environment. Milgram actually carried out 18 variations to his original study. He just changed one variable at a time to see what effect it had on the level of obedience. So here we're going to look at some of the situational factors that he altered to see what impact it had on obedience. Now, we're going to have a little bit of fun with this, so play along with me. Let's have a little bit of a game. I am going to explain to you the situational variable that was changed. Then I'd like you to have a moment to think, and that's when I will keep quiet, and I'd like you to shout out to the screen. So just imagine that I can hear you, that do you think it increased or decreased the level of obedience? So that's what I want you to do. Does it increase or decrease the level of obedience? So let's look at the first variation, change of venue. Now, the original study was carried out at Yale University, and that has, when it's a university, it's perceived status, but it was moved from this institution of status to an out-of-town, run-down office block. Please note the picture is not where it was taken. I just wanted something that looked run down. So to a real, do you think when the participants went to do the research, not conformity, obedience levels, did it increase or decrease? I'll give you a moment, have a think. Shout it out at the screen. Yes, you were right. It dropped from 65% down to 47.5. So people's obedience level dropped just by changing that one variable. Okay, here's our next one. Limited contact. The learner agreed to participate on the condition that you would let me out when I say so. So if the learner, who was the one getting the shocks, it says, I want to stop, what do we think obedience for the teacher had? Do we think obedience levels rose or dropped? What do you think? So a limited contract. So if the person says, I want to go, what do you think? Shout it out at the screen. Yes. Obedience levels dropped down to 40%. As soon as that teacher heard the person say, let me out of here, you would stop. You'd say, well, that person made a contract with me, it's limited, they can go. Next one. Increased proximity. Now, in the original study, the teacher and the student were in adjacent rooms. They were joining. There was a wall between them. But now, the teacher and the learner are in the same room. So the teacher can see the learner getting the electric shocks. Now, remember, the electric shocks weren't real. The learner was an actor. They were acting the role as if they were getting shocked. So what do we think? Obedience increased or decreased? That's right, it dropped down to only 40% of the participants obeyed and went all the way. So by seeing what you're doing, so proximity, the closer you are, and you can see what you're doing, obedience levels fall. Next variation, physical force. The teacher had to force the learner's hand onto a metal plate, and that's where the electric shock would be administered. So the teacher had to force it on there. So they physically forced it. Now, yes, you might think, well, why didn't they get electric shock? I'm sure they had something rubber over it. so that they would explain to the teacher that they wouldn't get the shock. So what do we think? Did obedience levels increase or decrease? Yep, it dropped down to 30% obedience. So when we are forcing that pain onto somebody else and we're physically forcing it, so we're contacting that person, we are seeing the destruction that we're causing, we're less likely to obey. Next variation, reduced proximity. The experimenter left the room, so it was just the teacher that was in the room, and he had to go away. So so he was giving the instructions via the telephone call. So the experimenter wasn't in the room. Did it increase or decrease obedience? What do we think? That's right. It dropped down to 20.5%. So really, yeah, when that legitimate authority figure is there, it's kind of like school. When I say to a student, please tuck in your shirt, a year 11 or year 12, if I walk away, they're less likely to do it. But if I stood there, they would tuck their shirt in. So it's having that a legitimate authority figure right there. So next variation. The experimenter was called away to take a phone call, and the role of the experimenter was taken over by an ordinary member of the public. So just a person dressed normally, but please note this was a Confederate. So there was a lack of uniform. So we're taking away that uniform, the lab coat, gave the experimenter the status level. So what do we think? Did it increase or decrease obedience? You're spot on. It dropped it down to 20%. So that tells us that if a person doesn't see that person as being legitimate, as having a higher status than them, so there was no lab coat there, so he didn't look like the experiment who knew what he was doing, obedience levels dropped. Next one, support, having social support. Teacher is given support from another teacher. Again, this other teacher was played by a Confederate, and this other teacher actually refused to obey. In certain circumstances, the friend, so the other teacher that was with the naive participant, refused to go administer any more shocks or go any further. What do we think that happened to obedience levels? Yeah, you're getting pretty good at this. It dropped down to 10%. So when we have social support, when we have somebody else who is not obeying, we're more likely to disobey as well. And I think we're coming up to our last one here. Getting someone else to do it for you. So the teacher is paired with a Confederate who they think is a teacher. They don't know, remember, they're a naive participant. The naive participant teacher asked the question, and it was the other teacher, the Confederate teacher, who actually gave the shock. What do we think obedience levels? Did it increase or decrease? Have a think about it. So the naive participant is asking the question, but the other teacher, who is a Confederate, remember the naive participant doesn't know that, is the one who gives the electric shock. I'm sure you've got this one right. Actually, obedience levels increased to 92.5%. So when we think somebody else is carrying out the action, we're more likely to be the authority figure. So when you look at this, Milgram changed one variable, one specific situational variable, and all these variables cover proximity, location, and uniform. So these cover, and if you look in your textbook, you can also see a nice little graph that displays it. But when we change that one variable, it can have an adverse effect on our level of obedience. So really, we've got a lot to learn from Milgram's variations with regards to situational variables. Okay, yes, it's AO3 time. I bet you're excited. I do love an AO3. Right, I'm only going to do a couple with you. I do expect you to be adding them to your notes and practice your appealing, but I'm going to say that again. Right, research support. So yeah, nice point. A strength of Milgram's variations is that there is a high level of research support, showing how situational variables influence a person's level of obedience. So we're really explaining the point. Now we want some evidence. Bickman. Now, I'm going to explain Bickman's study to you. Bickman carried out a field experiment. Remember, a field experiment is in a natural, everyday environment, which is good, gives us better, higher ecological validity. So I suppose we could bring that in as a little evaluate in our appeal. Oh, nice thought there, Mrs. Smith. Right. Remember, Milgram's original and his variations, it was a laboratory experiment, so we've got that external validity issue because of the artificial environment. But Bickman, I'm getting tongue-tied here, carried out a field experiment. Now, what he did in his field experiment is he had 3 confederates. Each confederate was dressed in a different type of clothing. One in normal civilian clothing, just normal everyday. The second one was dressed like a milkman. And the third one was dressed like a security guard, so had a security guard uniform on it. Now, the Confederates stood in the street and asked passersby to perform a task by picking up a piece of litter and putting it in the dustbin. Just simple, right? Please note, they weren't all 3 together at the same time. It would have been done at different times. Passersby, remember, this would have been a covert piece of research. People didn't know they were partaking it. So yes, there is that little ethical issue there of consent. But we walk past people in the street. So they would walk up to them, ask them to please pick up the rubbish and put it in the bin. What Bickman found was people were twice as likely to obey and assist the person dressed as a security guard as the one dressed in the normal everyday clothes. So it tells us that the security guard looked more like a legitimate authority figure compared to that of the person just dressed as normal clothes. The person dressed as the milkman, there was a level of obedience, but not to the extent as a security guard. So here we can see that clearly shows by changing what a person wore affected a person's level of obedience. So the person who looked more in authority, people were more likely to obey with regards to that. Another AO3. The nice thing about Milgram's original study and his variations was that there is a high level of control. That's a good thing that we want. That's the nice thing that a laboratory experiment gives us. Milgram clearly, and this is where a part of the control was, he clearly altered just one variable at a time. Original study carried out in Yale, he changed that one variable where it was carried out to a rundown office block. Just that one variable. Everything else stayed the same. All the other variables were kept the same. Nothing else was changed. And this clearly enabled Milgram to see whether that one variable that he changed, so that would have been the IV that he changed, and the DV would be able to measure the level of obedience. So here, he was able to establish a clear cause and effect, showing how influential the one variable that he altered on a person's level of obedience. Another support for Milgrams to have high level of control was because everything was controlled, standardized structures, standardized procedures, everything was carried out the same, he was able to replicate it more than 1,000 times. So he wouldn't be able to replicate it if he didn't have that control. Now, I've gone through three variations with you. I've gone over a couple of evaluations, so now it's your turn. I would like you to use a textbook and this video to take some time to write up your notes, right, putting down all that information, as well as practicing those peels. The more you practice, the better it is. You know, practice does make perfect. I know you're tired of me harping on about this, but it is really important with regards to it. Right, so happy working, and I will see you in session number 8. Wow, we're getting along here.